you grew up feeling like you were too much, too sensitive, too aware, too affected by things, this episode is for you. Not to go back and analyze your childhood, but to look at it differently now. Because a lot of what we were told about ourselves growing up was actually just a misunderstanding of what we were picking up on. And once you see that, a lot starts to make more sense. There is a certain kind of realization that happens really quietly. You hear someone describe something and you just pause. Like, oh wait, that explains something that I never had words for, but it makes so much sense. And it's not in a dramatic way. It's just kind of that quiet recognition that maybe what you were feeling growing up was real. You just didn't understand it yet. Welcome to this week's episode of More Than We See. And today I want to talk to the adults who grew up feeling like they were a little too much, too sensitive, too aware, too affected by things. And this isn't about going back and rewriting your childhood. It's about looking at it with a different lens now, a different perspective. Because I've had this conversation with a lot of people over the years, and that experience of being too much shows up in a lot of different ways. But the feeling of it, that's usually pretty similar, kind of stays the same. So if that lands for you, this episode is for you. Let's just take a second to ground this. This isn't about picking apart your past, and it's not about blaming anyone, and it's definitely not about fixing anything. You adapted the way you needed to, and that matters. What we're really doing here is kind of simpler than it sounds. We're just taking a second look at something that you experienced with more context than maybe you had at that time. Because when you don't understand what you're experiencing, you don't just ignore it. You make a meaning out of it. And a lot of times, that meaning turns inward. So let's talk about what this often looked like if you grew up feeling like too much. It often looked like something like you noticed moods really quickly, or you could feel when a room shifted, or you picked up on things before anyone else maybe said anything out loud about it, or maybe you even saw things. But instead of that being explained as perception or sensitivity, it often got framed differently. Like maybe you were told you were overreacting, or you're being dramatic, or you're just anxious or difficult or making things up, or that you just needed to toughen up. So what most people did in response to that framing was adapt. You learned to manage yourself. You second-guessed your reactions. You tried to tone down what you noticed. You stayed alert instead of expressive, and over time, a quiet message starts forming inside. Something about me must be off or wrong or strange. But let's set the record straight for a moment. Sensitivity isn't an identity. It's a way of taking in information. Some people simply notice more data. Some people register subtle shifts in people or the environments they're in. Some people feel emotional or energetic cues more quickly. Some people sense those on the other side of the veil. When that ability doesn't have context or explanation, the brain still needs a story for it. And most of the time, that story becomes self-blame. Not because anything is wrong. Your system, your processing system, was just trying to make sense of what it was experiencing. And in most families and cultures, there simply isn't a language for what was experienced. Is it information or is it identity? The distinction matters more than people realize. What you noticed growing up was absolutely information. It wasn't your identity. But when information gets mistaken for identity, people start forming conclusions about themselves. Things like, I'm too sensitive, or I'm wired wrong, or I'm bad at handling life. But sensitivity isn't fragility, and it doesn't mean something needs fixing. Or maybe the other side of the coin is that you were special or gifted. Both can be an uncomfortable label or identity to hang around a growing light. But it usually just means your system was receiving more input than you were taught how to process. So how does this mean we aren't rewriting the past? Okay, I want to be clear on this. Understanding this now does not mean that your parents failed or that your environment was wrong or that someone should have done something differently. Most people did the best they could with what they had. And you did too. You adapted intelligently. Those adaptations probably helped you function, succeed, and navigate your environment. You're here. Nothing needs to be undone. This is really just about updating the interpretation, not reopening the experience. And remember, the way you adapted probably helped you navigate the world just fine. So let's pull this into a try it moment for the episode. Because where would we be without tools that improve our perspectives or lives? So here's a small exercise. Think of a moment from childhood where you remember feeling like you were too much. Not the hardest moment necessarily, just the one that comes to mind easily. This could be something you experienced over and over that maybe you struggled with, or some one-off experience that's just popping up for you. And instead of analyzing it, I want you to ask a question from a new perspective. Rather than, what was I thinking? Or am I crazy? Or your normal approach, however that was. I want you to ask yourself, what am I picking up? What did I see? What was the environment? Was it tension? Was it a shift in mood? Was it something unspoken in the room? A sense that something had changed? Just name the information that you were noticing. Your experience was you receiving that information in a different way, maybe unique to the people around you, but still information. And then just stop there. No digging, no emotional excavation, just recognition. When sensitivity starts being understood as information instead of identity, a few things change naturally. 1, you stop pathologizing your reactions. 2, you trust what you notice without exaggerating it. 3, you respond instead of bracing. And maybe most importantly, 4, you stop feeling like you have to make yourself smaller to stay steady or normal for someone else's experience. Nothing about you needs correcting. Sometimes it just needs a clearer context. As you start to open up, noticing more and recalling those childhood moments, just write the information, big or small, down into a notebook, phone app. Allow yourself access to that information. Allow your intuition to speak to you. Before we wrap up, I want to share something from my personal childhood. Because when I talk about noticing more, I'm not speaking theoretically. I grew up in houses where I heard things that other people didn't seem to hear. Footsteps in the hallway, voices in the other room, movement in the house when it was quiet. And when you're a kid, you don't have a framework for that. You just know something is happening and you feel different. So for a long time, I did exactly what many of you probably did. I assumed it must be me. Maybe I am imagining things. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe my brain was making something up until one night something happened that I still remember really clearly. I saw someone. And that's not the strange part. That, had happened before. The strange part was they saw me see them. And there was a moment of recognition, like both of us realized at the same time that I was aware. And that moment changed something in me. Because suddenly it wasn't me. It wasn't what's wrong with me. It was more like, okay, maybe I'm not imagining this. Maybe I'm noticing something other people aren't. And that's really the shift we've been talking about in this episode. Not proving anything, not forcing belief, just allowing the possibility that sometimes what we experienced growing up was information we just didn't have a language for yet. So if you grew up feeling like you were too much, too sensitive, too aware, too affected by things, there's a good chance you were simply noticing more than the people around you understood. And when there isn't language for something, people usually default to labeling it. But labeling something is not the same as understanding it. Now as adults, we get to do something different. We get to look back with more context, more curiosity, and a little more kindness towards ourselves. Because what many of us called too much back then might actually have been our intuition or sixth sense. And intuition is something you can learn to work with, not something you have to hide from. So if this episode made you recognize pieces of your own story, just sit with that for a moment. Notice what memories come up. Notice you might have been picking up on things. And see what changes when you give those moments a little more language. Thanks for spending time with me today. I'll see you next time on More Than We See.